That morning, as the first sunlight spread over the rolling hills, Mr. Henderson stepped onto his porch. He was dressed in well-worn overalls and boots that had seen many seasons. In one hand, he held a stainless steel thermos of coffee, in the other, a small trowel. A wide-brimmed hat sat on his head, shading his weathered, friendly face. He made his way to the half-acre plot just behind his home, where rows of vegetables fanned out in neat lines: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, collard greens, and a few experimental rows of herbs. It was a patchwork of vibrant green. Kneeling down, Mr. Henderson checked the moisture of the soil by running his fingers through it, nodding to himself at the healthy dampness. He grinned. This was his life's passion, something he had nurtured since he bought the land nearly 30 years ago. "Morning, beauties," he whispered to the plants, brushing a stray leaf. This small ritual never failed to calm him. He didn't know it yet, but that ordinary start to the day would be the last bit of peace he'd have for a while. Trouble was lurking in the form of his relatively new neighbor, Kenny Hoa, who occupied a property on the hill behind him. Before the sun had even fully risen, Kenny was wide awake and already plotting something that would turn Mr. Henderson's life upside down. Kenny Hoa was around 35, lean, and always looked sharp in pressed pants, button-down shirts, and polished shoes, an odd sight in a community where dust, denim, and work boots were the norm. He had moved into the valley about 6 months prior, settling in a slightly dilapidated house that nonetheless offered a sweeping view of the surrounding properties, including Mr. Henderson's garden. Rumors about Kenny spread fast: that he was born in another state, that he'd hopped from one real estate deal to another, that he had a habit of tangling with neighbors. Some locals had tried to welcome him with homemade pies and invitations to backyard barbecues, but Kenny brushed them off with minimal courtesy. He was known to complain about barking dogs or the noise of a lawnmower at dawn, matters that most Brookside Valley folks accepted as part of country living. The neighbors quickly learned to leave him alone. Early that same morning, Kenny stood on his back porch, sipping coffee from a sleek black mug. He stared down at Mr. Henderson's flourishing vegetable rows, eyes narrowing in discontent. In his hand, he held a folded letter from the county's Land and Development Office, a letter that mentioned a potentially inactive easement adjoining Kenny's property line and Mr. Henderson's. The letter suggested that if this easement wasn't officially vacated or properly recorded, there might be a legal gray area about who truly owned or controlled that small strip of land. Inactive, huh? Kenny murmured, smirking as if he'd discovered a hidden gold mine. If that patch was in limbo, he might leverage it somehow. Maybe push Mr. Henderson off a portion of his garden. Maybe force a settlement. Money, power, or just the satisfaction of lording it over a neighbor. Kenny's motives weren't clear to anyone but himself. But one thing was sure: he wanted control. He chugged the last of his coffee, set the mug down, and walked inside. Over the next few days, rumors would swirl that Kenny had been making visits to the county clerk's office, rummaging through property maps, and talking to local attorneys. But at that very moment, he was only thinking one thing: Mr. Henderson's vegetable plot might be mine for the taking. A few days later, Mr. Henderson was out in the yard, carefully checking the underside of tomato leaves for aphids. It was late morning, and the sun was climbing. Sweat dotted his temples, but he was in good spirits. The faint fragrance of jasmine drifted from a nearby trellis. That's when he heard the crunch of footsteps approaching from the side fence. He turned to see a man wearing dress slacks, a crisp button-down shirt, and polished loafers. Kenny Hoa. Mr. Henderson removed his straw hat politely and gave a neighborly nod. "Good morning," Mr. Henderson said. "Can I help you with something?" Kenny studied the older man for a moment before speaking. "I'm Kenny. I live up there." He gestured toward the house on the hill. "Thought I'd come by to talk about our property lines." Mr. Henderson felt a flicker of unease. Property line disputes were rare here, but they almost never ended well. Still, he kept a calm tone. "Well, how do you do, Kenny? I'm Isaac Henderson, but everyone just calls me Mr. Henderson. I've lived here for close to 3 decades. He paused. "What about the property lines concerns you?" Kenny gave a tight-lipped smile. "I've been speaking with the county about some easements and expansions. Turns out there might be an old utility easement running along the back edge of your garden." It's possible that part of your garden is on a chunk of land that isn't officially yours." Mr. Henderson's kind face took on a puzzled frown. "Not mine? I bought this place many years ago. Been paying taxes on it. Cultivating it the whole time. This is the first I've heard about any active easement. Maybe you never looked into it. Or maybe it got overlooked," Kenny said with a casual shrug. "But, if that easement is still recognized by the county, you might be violating property codes. Just a friendly heads up." The older man felt a clench in his chest. No one had ever questioned his ownership. Over the decades, he'd welcomed neighbors to pick tomatoes or lettuce as they pleased. "I appreciate the heads up," Mr. Henderson replied, managing a courteous smile, "but I've got paperwork for my land. If there's confusion, I guess I'll talk to the county." Kenny nodded slowly, a hint of condescension in his voice. "Probably a good idea. I'd hate for there to be trouble. Especially at your age." Mr. Henderson's cheeks warmed at the subtle jab. But he kept composure. "Thank you," he said softly, hoping that would end the conversation. Kenny lingered a moment, studying the lush rows of vegetables as if he'd already claimed them in his mind. Then he turned and walked off, tossing a casual, "Have a nice day," over his shoulder. Mr. Henderson watched him go, an uncomfortable feeling settling in his stomach. As the week progressed, Mr. Henderson couldn't shake the uneasy sensation that something was brewing. He tried to continue his routine, watering in the early mornings, weeding mid-afternoon, harvesting vegetables for dinner, but he found himself glancing up the slope more often, half expecting to see Kenny peering down. The friendly neighbors of Brookside Valley noticed the tension too. A local teacher, Gloria Anderson, stopped by to pick up a basket of cucumbers and asked if Mr. Henderson was all right. She noted he looked worried, not his usual jovial self. He gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Oh, I'm just concerned about some talk of property lines. No big deal. I hope. You let me know if you need anything," Gloria said, sincere worry in her brown eyes. "We're a community, Mr. Henderson. Remember that." He thanked her warmly. Though the anxiety lingered, he was proud and didn't want to cause a stir. But something about Kenny's behavior didn't feel like a mere misunderstanding. All doubts were confirmed when Mr. Henderson received a letter a few days later, hand-delivered by a courier. Its header read Templeton and Reed, attorneys at law. He opened it carefully while sitting at his kitchen table, the afternoon sun shining through the thin curtains. "Dear Mr. Isaac Henderson, we represent Mr. Kenny Hoa in a matter concerning a potential land easement on or near your property. According to our client's findings, you may be cultivating a portion of land that remains under dispute. We hereby request that you immediately cease all agricultural activity on the contested strip of land. Remove any fences or structures that may lie on said easement. Provide proof of full legal ownership within 10 days. Failure to comply may result in legal action, including but not limited to an injunction preventing further use of the area in question. Sincerely, Templeton and Reed." Mr. Henderson's hands trembled. He had never received such a formal threat in his life. He sat there, heart-pounding, rereading the letter until the words blurred. The old man pressed his lips together, refusing to let panic overtake him. "This can't be right," he thought. "I own this land." After a few deep breaths, he stood up from the table and walked to an old metal filing cabinet in his small study. Inside were folders and envelopes, tax statements, mortgage documents, a property deed, and a few letters from the county dating back years. He pulled out everything he thought relevant and spread them across his desk. His eyes scanned each page. There it was. A record from nearly 2 decades ago confirming that any utility easement had been abandoned by the county. Another letter mentioned no further claims or expansions. It seemed clear to him. So how could Kenny claim otherwise? That evening, sleep eluded him. He paced the living room, occasionally glancing out the window at the dark silhouette of the hill. What was Kenny's endgame? Did he really think an old man would roll over and hand over a portion of his cherished garden? Was this about money, or just raw power? The next morning, Mr. Henderson dialed the number of his longtime friend and neighbor, Alan Roberts, a retired carpenter who lived about half a mile down the road. Alan was in his late 60s, big-boned, with a silver beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He picked up on the second ring. "Alan, it's Isaac," Mr. Henderson said softly. "I need some advice. It's about a letter. From that new fella? Kenny something?" Alan asked, voice edged with concern. Yes, Mr. Henderson confirmed. He's got lawyers sending me notices about my garden. Don't fret, Alan said. We'll figure this out. Let's meet at your place this afternoon. True to his word, Alan arrived in his trusty old Ford pickup just after lunchtime. Wearing an old baseball cap, he got out and gave Mr. Henderson a firm handshake. Mr. Henderson led him inside, where they sat at the kitchen table. The older man slid the letter and documents across to Alan, who read them in silence, occasionally letting out a low grunt of disapproval. Damn, Alan finally muttered, setting the papers down. This is a cheap trick. The county declared that easement inactive years ago. That's what I thought, Mr. Henderson said, relieved to have Alan confirm it. Alan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. He's counting on you not having the resources to fight a legal battle. Lawyers are expensive, Isaac, but you do have documents on your side. Mr. Henderson fiddled with the edge of the letter. I'm worried it won't matter. Sometimes, people with lawyers can make trouble. You know how it goes. They can push you around if you don't push back. Alan nodded, his expression grim. Well, we can't let him bully you. You might need your own attorney. I know a local one, Rebecca Powell. She's handled property disputes before. Not cheap, but she's fair and fights hard. Mr. Henderson sighed. I don't have much choice. Do I? You do, Alan said, voice gentle. But if you let him keep pushing, he might get the county to reconsider that easement. Next thing you know, they're saying your garden's in violation of something. We need to nip this in the bud. A short silence fell. Finally, Mr. Henderson nodded, resolved. All right, let's call Rebecca. I can't let him take what I've spent decades building. Alan smiled reassuringly. That's the spirit. The following day, Mr. Henderson set foot in the tidy office of Powell and Hammonds. Nestled on the main street of the nearest town, Rebecca Powell was in her early 40s. With sharp gray eyes and a confident air, she wore a charcoal suit and greeted Mr. Henderson kindly, offering him a seat at a polished oak desk. Alan's told me a bit about the situation, Rebecca said, powering up her computer. Let's go over everything carefully. Over the course of an hour, Mr. Henderson laid out the entire story, from Kenny's initial visit to the threatening letter, culminating in the possibility of a reactivated easement. He handed over copies of his deed, tax receipts, and the old county correspondence about the easement being abandoned. Rebecca examined them one by one. This is quite comprehensive. If the county declared the easement abandoned, that's a strong piece of evidence in your favor. Typically, once these easements are vacated, the land reverts fully to the property owner, unless there's a contradictory record we don't know about. Mr. Henderson swallowed. That's what scares me. Could there be something we don't know? There's always a chance, Rebecca admitted, tapping the desk thoughtfully. But I suspect Kenny's lawyers are fishing for something to exploit. They might have found an old reference to the easement and are hoping you'll panic. Either pay them off, or agree to sign away some usage rights. Stay calm. We'll file a response. Demand they produce any documents that say the easement still exists. The old man felt relief wash through him. So, I have a real case to stand on? Rebecca nodded firmly. Absolutely. We'll argue this is your property. Fair and square. If they want to fight, we'll counter that their claim is frivolous. I'll keep you informed every step of the way. Thank you, Mr. Henderson said, voice thick with emotion. This garden's my life. I don't know what I'd do if I lost it. Rebecca offered a small smile. We won't let that happen easily. We'll do everything we can. Leaving the office, Mr. Henderson felt a bit lighter. The threat wasn't gone, but at least he had a professional on his side. Word of the dispute soon traveled around Brookside Valley. Neighbors who'd enjoyed Mr. Henderson's vegetables for years were outraged at the idea of someone challenging his right to grow them. Some folks started dropping by unannounced, bringing pies, encouraging words, and offers to help him in the garden. A couple even suggested organizing a petition to present to the county, emphasizing how vital Mr. Henderson's garden was to the community. He tried to remain humble, insisting he didn't want to stir up drama. But every kind gesture reminded him how close-knit Brookside Valley could be. It also highlighted how much was at stake. If Kenny succeeded, it might embolden other unscrupulous newcomers to file similar claims, unraveling the sense of neighborly trust that had prevailed for decades. Meanwhile, Kenny stayed out of sight, Some folks saw him zipping in and out of his driveway in a black sedan, presumably heading to meetings with his attorney or the county clerk. The tension in the valley rose, a palpable undercurrent of anxiety for many residents. One night, around midnight, Mr. Henderson was awakened by a strange noise outside, a sharp crunch of footsteps near the back fence. Heart pounding, he reached for his flashlight and peered out his bedroom window. In the moonlight, he glimpsed a figure moving near the rows of vegetables. It was too dark to see clearly, but the silhouette looked vaguely like a man with a hood or cap. Alarmed, Mr. Henderson slipped on his boots and robe, grabbed his flashlight more firmly, and crept outside through the back door. His breath clouded in the cool night air. He could hear rustling near the cucumbers. With each step, the old wooden porch creaked beneath him, the only noise in the stillness. Then a harsh scraping sound, like something metal striking wood. He shone the flashlight beam onto the spot, and the figure bolted. Running toward the fence, Mr. Henderson caught the glimpse of a man's back disappearing over the fence line. The beam fell on a broken cucumber trellis. The wood splintered, and the leaves torn. "Hey, who's there?" Mr. Henderson yelled, his voice echoing, but no answer came, only silence. He surveyed the damage in dismay. Several vines had been yanked or trampled in the flight. He couldn't be sure it was Kenny or someone working for him. But the timing was too suspicious. Anxiety coiled in his chest like a snake. This was more than just legal intimidation, it felt like sabotage. Shaken, he returned indoors and locked the door, something he rarely bothered to do in such a peaceful place. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Early the next morning, Mr. Henderson discovered a row of wooden stakes hammered into the ground near the back boundary of his property, stark evidence of some kind of amateur land survey. Pink survey ribbons fluttered in the gentle breeze, each one cutting directly through a portion of his vegetable rows. A few plants were crushed beneath these newly staked lines. On one of the stakes, he found a water-resistant tag emblazoned with the words, "Property Survey, Templeton and Reed." It was like a slap in the face. They were asserting a claim in the most physical way possible. He bent down and touched a crushed head of lettuce, feeling anger bubble inside him. He had never truly hated anyone in his life. He'd been disappointed, hurt, or angry, but this was different. It was a violation that cut to the core of his identity. Standing, Mr. Henderson pulled out his phone and snapped photos of the stakes, the ribbons, and the damage to his plants. Then he dialed Rebecca Powell's office. She picked up after a couple of rings. "Rebecca, it's me, Mr. Henderson. They put survey stakes in my garden. I didn't give permission. They damaged my plants." Rebecca's tone sharpened. "They're required by law to give notice before any survey or inspection on your property. Did you receive any official notice of an upcoming survey?" "Not a word," he answered, exasperated. "I'll handle it," Rebecca promised. "In the meantime, don't remove the stakes just yet. Take photos. Document everything. We'll use it as evidence." He hung up, exhaling to steady himself. His garden was a battleground now. The stakes literal proof that Kenny intended to force a confrontation. That afternoon, while Mr. Henderson was readying some damaged vines, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see Kenny Hoa stepping out of his black sedan at the front of the driveway. Kenny wore an expensive-looking blazer, his expression radiating confidence or arrogance, depending on how you read it. Mr. Henderson straightened his aching back. Bracing himself, Kenny walked up with slow, measured strides, glancing around as though appraising the place. "Mr. Henderson," Kenny said, his voice cordial but dripping with condescension. "I heard you found the survey markers." Mr. Henderson's jaw tightened. "That's right, you tore up some of my plants. You had no permission to survey my yard." Kenny tilted his head, feigning ignorance. "Templeton and Reed arranged the survey. I'm sure they followed whatever protocols are required. Maybe you missed the letter. These things happen." Mr. Henderson's eyes flashed anger. "I didn't miss anything, and they sure didn't have my consent to hammer stakes into my property." Kenny shrugged. "Let's look at the bigger picture. If the survey shows that part of your garden is on an easement, you'll have to remove it anyway. Save us both time and just clear that space. Or we can come to an agreement." "What kind of agreement?" the old man asked, dread twisting in his stomach. "Oh, a lease arrangement. For instance, you pay me a monthly fee, and I won't enforce the easement. You get to keep your vegetable patch." I get compensation for letting you borrow what's mine." A self-satisfied smirk spread across Kenny's face. Mr. Henderson couldn't believe the audacity. "You're the one trying to grab land that's not yours." Kenny let out a dismissive chuckle. "We'll let the lawyers and courts decide. But if you want to avoid mounting legal fees, my offer stands." He handed over a folded piece of paper. "A simple agreement. Think about it." Mr. Henderson stared at the paper in his hand, pulse pounding. Every fiber of his being wanted to tear it up on the spot. But he held back, not wanting to give Kenny the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He looked the younger man square in the eye. "You're not going to scare me into paying for my own land." Kenny's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, narrow-eyed gaze. "If you pass up this offer, don't cry foul when the court sides with me." He spun on his heel, got back into his sedan, and pulled away without another word. Mr. Henderson stood there, the paper trembling in his grasp. The front page read, "Private lease agreement for easement use." He crushed it in his fist, marching straight to the house to call Rebecca Powell. By early evening, Mr. Henderson sat in his living room, phone to his ear as he recounted the day's confrontation to Rebecca. She listened calmly, occasionally asking for clarification. When he finished, she spoke firmly. "All right, we'll draft a formal cease and desist regarding these unauthorized surveys and any trespassing. We'll also file a motion in court demanding they show actual proof of this so-called easement's validity. And if they've damaged your crops, that could be grounds for a claim on your side." Mr. Henderson nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Yes, I want to do whatever it takes." "I'm with you," Rebecca said, "but be prepared, Kenny might escalate. People like him don't back down easily." The old man swallowed, his throat tight. "I'd rather stand up for myself and lose than give in to a bully." "Exactly," she said. "Sit tight. I'll handle the legal side. Document everything, and call me if there's any new development." After hanging up, Mr. Henderson sank into his worn recliner. The living room was filled with the soft glow of a single lamp. On the mantel were photos of him in younger days, images of a simpler, happier time when he first planted the garden. Holding up baskets of fresh produce with a broad grin, he closed his eyes, running through memories of neighbors stopping by with empty baskets, leaving with them full and beaming with gratitude. Families had relied on him for fresh vegetables, and he was proud to provide. This garden was more than rows of plants, it was the core of who he was. A symbol of kindness and community. He wasn't about to let it be taken by greed. Even as fatigue pressed in on him, the old man's determination stood firm. He had come too far and worked too hard. Kenny might have money, lawyers, and cunning tactics, but Mr. Henderson had truth on his side. And a community ready to back him. He resolved to see this through, no matter how long or difficult it became.